first step I do is I definitely have a call with the client, whoever that is, and just have a conversation about what this brief actually means. The best thing in that call is for me just to ask a bunch of questions and to write down everything and anything that they say. And that's really important for me to refer back to later on, because sometimes the client says words repeatedly that help me concept something. And so when I had the initial conversation with Murray, he kind of described what he thought the conference theme of that year, which was creative tension, means to him. And he wanted, the titles to feel positive and upbeat and to get people really excited about sitting in the audience and getting ready to experience semi-permanent that year. So he described these three things, like a pushing and pulling of when, you have a bunch of ideas and you don't know which direction to go. And there's just typically a number of friction points when you're coming up with an idea or in the creative process. And finally, there's a sense of release when you come up with a concept or you deliver a project. So these were the ideas that he connected creative tension to in his mind. And he also talked about how design was for good and for the environment. Like he felt really positively about how the feeling of semi-permanent was always for the good of the world. So I wrote these things down in this initial brain dump, as I call it. And off the back of that, I pretty much just write anything that comes to mind, even if they're not very good. And so you'll see idea number one, I thought maybe there's 4 or 5 chapters and each chapter is inspired by a city, the city that the person who I'm collaborating with is located in. And maybe it's a mix of mediums. These are just random points. I came up with 3 really general ideas at this point. And I typically do this for all my projects. Just write a bunch of things and see what sticks. So I typically, as a director, only present one idea, just because it allows me to focus my energy on developing something really well, but also I don't like giving my clients, especially if I'm pitching a general direction, choice. Because typically, I always feel strongly about one idea or the other, so I don't want to risk my client choosing the other idea that I'm not as psyched about. So after I have this initial brain dump of ideas, I try to see which one I feel the strongest about. I ended up presenting just one, but it took me a really long time to get there. And it was a huge stress point for me because I was I need the right concept. If I pick the wrong concept, this could not be the project that I'm really excited about. It took me longer than it did most jobs, actually. And it got to a point where I felt like the internet had failed me. And I went to a library. I went to New York Public Library to look up books because I was nothing in the internet is helping me. So I decided to look at books. And that's when I saw Ernest Haeckel's work in a textbook in biology section or something. And I was okay, this is the key reference that I want to shape my idea around. Off the back of that, I dive into making a mood board, which is very, very step one of any creative process. And just decided to consolidate and collect all these images that I felt were related to the color, the type, and the idea of science. I made mood boards for texture, for color. Yeah, you can see it's super textural and a lot of microorganism photos. I still felt it was lacking a skeleton. I always like to weave a narrative, even if it is going to be a very abstract piece. So I was still searching for what that narrative was until I, saw Ernest Haeckel's work and decided maybe we could chart or follow a microorganism from birth to death and try and use that as a visual metaphor for creative tension, which was the theme of the conference. So that was the idea that I presented to Semi-Permanent. And because this was a Dropbox sponsored piece, I did my treatment in Dropbox paper, even though I don't normally do that. Normally I just do like a Google Slides or an InDesign document with a PDF. So you can see like I started with an explanation of where the inspiration for the idea came from, which was an explanation of like how I connected design and science together and how I found Heikel's work and how that kind of weaved into visual metaphor of creative tension. So that was this paragraph. And then I went into like a story, basically. I thought the titles could come in 3 acts. So this was a little breakdown of that narrative. And then I went into the visual references themselves and what I liked about them. And then I typically like to include at least a few motion references as well, because I feel like that, since it's obviously a motion piece, the client needs to see something also in motion. And typically I talk about a technique, either how we're going to make things or how we're going to approach things. Since this was going to be a collaborative piece, I wrote down how I thought this process could work. Yeah, some thoughts about the music as well. And then some like really initial rough star frames of all of the things that I just described into a couple of images, like the color, the big typography, the texture that I was really looking for. And these were like just super rough, but you know, the client can get the vibe of how it would come together. He loved it for sure. He thought like the idea of like the microorganisms from birth to death was like really awesome. But he did have a few thoughts about what to add to it. So his one idea to kind of bring in was like humor, which is a very hard note to hit because humor is such a subjective thing. And he then suggested, could this be a different merge of styles? And these were definitely things I considered after he suggested it. But to be honest, there was a lot of things that I just kind of disregarded as well, because in the end, this was a unpaid job. So I felt like I had the power to say no to some of these suggestions, because had this been a paid job for, you know, a brand, for something that I didn't have creative control of, then definitely would have been something I had to kind of push back, kind of like work it into my concept. So we talked about it on a phone call and was like, you know, I was like so thankful for his feedback and that he loved the overall direction. I just felt like these specific points were very hard to kind of hit in the time frame that we have and for the overall creative that we were hoping to achieve. Thankfully, Murray was he's very understanding. When I went through all these points, I'm like, yeah, I totally get it. And he had complete faith in that, you know, what we would make in the long run would be beautiful and amazing for different reasons.